Instead of fighting for transparency, however, Obama became a far more effective manager of the national security state. Like Bush, he repeatedly invoked the state secrets privilege in lawsuits involving torture, extraordinary rendition, and illegal NSA eavesdropping. He blocked habeas corpus rights for enemy combatants, preserved military commissions, and authorized without due process the killing of a U.S. citizen in Yemen accused of having ties to al-Qaeda. Obama stunned civil libertarians when he took Bush-era investigations to the next level and began prosecuting government whistleblowers and reporters using the World War I-era Espionage Act. Only 3 cases had been brought in 92 years. Obama initiated 6 cases of dubious merit, most defendants claiming to have exposed unlawful activity in the government. Most prominent was Bradley Manning, an Army intelligence analyst in Iraq who leaked over 260,000 classified diplomatic cables and war reports, as well as videos, distributed by WikiLeaks, a non-profit whistleblower media organization. These revelations of U.S. war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan and U.S. support for dictatorial regimes in the region proved to be a significant catalyst for the Arab Spring uprisings in Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, Libya, and Bahrain. Nonetheless, Obama's administration has severely impaired the operation of WikiLeaks and threatens to prosecute its co-founder. These actions send a clear message to all whistleblowers. Commit war crimes like Bush and Cheney, and you walk free. Expose them, and you risk careers and huge fines. Or, like Manning, you rot in jail. One of the leading defenders of the new standards of conduct, Jack Goldsmith, former head of the Bush Office of Legal Counsel, reassured Cheney and other anxious neocons in an article saying that Obama was
like Nixon going to China. The changes he had made are destined to fortify the bulk of the Bush program for the long run.
This was a new shadow world. In 2010, the Washington Post called it an alternative geography of the United States, a top-secret America hidden from public view. Almost 1.5 million people had top security clearances. More than 3,000 government and private security corporations existed. 1.7 billion emails and communications were intercepted and stored every day by the National Security Agency. Political commentator and constitutional lawyer Glenn Greenwald best described this truly radical change in our world when he wrote, "The core guarantee of Western justice since the Magna Carta was codified in the U.S. by the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." He might well have added the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, the right to privacy and protection against unreasonable search and seizure. Without due process and the right to privacy, each of us is essentially living at the mercy of the surveillance state. All this in the name of stopping a terrorist threat blown wildly out of proportion. Obama's foreign policy seemed more reasonable than Bush's, repudiating the unilateralism and preemption that had so outraged world opinion. But the goal, embracing U.S. global domination, differed little, and even the means were frustratingly similar. In 2011, Bush's former NSA and CIA director, General Michael Hayden, took comfort in the powerful continuity between 2 vastly different presidents, saying that
Americans have found a comfortable center line in what it is they accept their government doing.
he called it a
practical consensus.
His own experience in foreign affairs limited, Obama surrounded himself with hawkish advisors, among them Bush holdover Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, a hardliner from the Bill Casey CIA era of the 80s. Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, was equally hawkish. In an early speech, Clinton presented a version of American history steeped in unvarnished triumphalism and historical amnesia.
So let me say it clearly. The United States can, must, and will lead in this new century. The Third World War that so many feared never came. And many millions of people were lifted out of poverty and exercised their human rights for the first time. Those were the benefits of a global architecture forged over many years by American leaders from both political parties.
It would be difficult to find and ask the millions killed over many decades of American interference in their countries what they thought. The people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Philippines, Central America, Greece, Iran, Brazil, Cuba, Congo, Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Chile, East Timor, Iraq, and Afghanistan, among others. In Afghanistan, Obama, calling it a war of necessity, doubled down on Bush. Pressured in late 2009 into sending more troops, he wavered. He was told by a military advisor, "I don't see how you can defy your military chain here," meaning that his high command might resign in protest. CIA Director Leon Panetta told him, "No Democratic president can go against military advice, especially if he asks for it. So just do it," he recommended. Do what they say. When it came down to his decision, Obama did not show the courage of a John Kennedy. In December, he announced another 30,000 troop increase to reach almost 100,000, about the same number the Soviets had deployed in their disastrous invasion of Afghanistan. He announced the troop increase at West Point, reminding the cadets that the U.S. had invaded Afghanistan because it had provided sanctuary for al-Qaeda. But he neglected to mention that most of the preparations for 9/11 took place not in Afghanistan, but in apartments in Germany and Spain and flight schools in the U.S. Or that only 50 to 100 of al-Qaeda's 300 cadre were actually left in Afghanistan, and that most were now in Pakistan, an ally. That the president waging two wars would receive the Nobel Peace Prize that same month was surreal in the first place. But when the world heard Obama's defense of American unilateralism and preemption, the meaning of the prize had been diminished, as it had by Kissinger 36 years earlier.
I believe the United States of America must remain a standard bearer in the conduct of war. That is what makes us different from those whom we fight.
Obama feared getting bogged down in Afghanistan as Johnson had in Vietnam. What the backward, dirt-poor, overwhelmingly illiterate Afghans needed was economic aid, education, and social reform. The U.S. spent $110 billion on military programs in 2011, but only $2 billion for sustainable development.
But we're leaving behind a sovereign, stable, and self-reliant Iraq. Unlike the old empires, we don't make these sacrifices for territory or for resources. do it because it's right. Never forget that you are part of an unbroken line of heroes spanning 2 centuries. To your grandparents and parents who faced down fascism and communism and delivered justice to those who attacked us on 9/11.
Thus sanctioning once again Bush's lie about the connection of 9/11 to Iraq. The words were barely out of his mouth before Iraq was racked with a new series of deadly suicide bombings. To this day, Iraq teeters on the edge of civil war. Among the 2 war's fiercest critics were the nation's mayors, who gathered in Baltimore in June 2011 and called for using $126 billion in savings from these wars to rebuild the nation's cities. The mayor of Los Angeles was quoted as saying,
That we would build bridges in Baghdad and Kandahar and not Baltimore and Kansas City absolutely boggles the mind.
for the American people deadened to these wars, a single bright spot in this foreign miasma came in May 2011. A bold cross-border raid at night by Navy SEALs killed Osama bin Laden, living comfortably in the shadow of Pakistan's premier military academy. In the euphoria the raid created in the U.S., celebrating the skill and power of the SEALs who had executed bin Laden vigilante style and dumped his body at sea, a new profile was created for Obama as, unlike Bush, an effective war president who would, by any means necessary, hunt down the enemy. In fact, really a wolf in sheep's clothing.
After a firefight, they killed Osama bin Laden and took custody of his body.
A celebrated movie even implied torture as effective in finding bin Laden, though in fact it had been ordinary police and espionage work that located him after almost 10 years.
Forgotten country. Geronimo's KIA.
Oh my God.
Nonetheless, America's capacity for self-love was again in full flower, and there were no troubling discussions of bringing a wounded bin Laden back for imprisonment and trial, as the United States had done at Nuremberg, where the Nazi defendants were unmasked and diminished. But a trial was the last thing most Americans wanted. Those who accepted torture could tolerate vigilante justice. But who was the real victor here? After estimated trillions of dollars spent, 2 wars, hundreds of thousands of dead worldwide, an endless war on terror, the loss of civil liberties and confidence in one presidency, and the near collapse of the empire's financial structure along with it, it can be said by a neutral observer that at the least the U.S. had won a Pyrrhic victory in which its losses had made victory pointless. Bin Laden, with his twisted vision of a new caliphate, was dead, but had achieved far more than he ever dreamed. He goaded the largest, most powerful empire in history to reveal its worst nature. And like the Wizard of Oz, it didn't look so great and mighty.
Who are you?
Oh, I am the great and powerful Wizard of Oz.
Bin Laden's martyrdom in the eyes of his followers cemented his place in the history books as a catalyst who weakened and perhaps helped destroy the old world order. Some might call him the Hannibal or Attila of Roman myth, a Robespierre to the old French order, Lenin to Tsarist Russia, even a modern Hitler to the British Empire, which came to its end in his wake. Bin Laden was gone, but what would the United States do now? Still tormented by its demons, it turned its gaze fully to China as a new threat and persisted in treating Russia as an old one, as well as maintaining Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela as regional threats. Seeking to find a more efficient, leaner form of warfare, Obama in 2012 announced a 14% cut in future infantry strength to be compensated for by an increased emphasis in outer space and cyberspace. First used for surveillance in Vietnam, the drone, when equipped with missiles, was now becoming the modern face of warfare and Obama's weapon of choice. He personally began selecting those on the kill list. Prior to 9/11, the United States had opposed extrajudicial targeted killing by other nations, condemning Israel's targeting of Palestinians. But by 2012, the Air Force and CIA were deploying a 7,000 drone armada, used mostly in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Pakistan. Obama expanded its usage to Yemen in 2009, where there were fewer than 300 militants. By mid-2012, that number had increased to over 1,000 as a steady barrage of U.S. drone attacks outraged Yemeni citizens. By 2012, Obama added Gaddafi's Libyan supporters, Islamic rebels in the Philippines, and Somalia to the drone list. The repercussions of this style of warfare are yet to be experienced. The number of civilian casualties of these attacks are fiercely contested by the U.S. government and several human rights organizations. When the judge asked the Pakistani-born Times Square bomber how he could risk killing innocent women and children, he replied that U.S. drones were regularly killing women and children in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The cat was certainly out of the bag, and by 2012, more than 50 countries, some friendly and some hostile to the U.S., had purchased drones. Israel, Russia, India, and Iran claimed to have mastered manufacturing lethal ones, but the most dynamic program was China's. As with the nuclear bomb, a new arms race was on. Bush had continued Clinton's expansion of NATO bases closer to Russia, breaking his father's promise to Gorbachev. Obama expanded NATO to Albania and Croatia, and despite abandoning 500 bases in Iraq, the Obama administration, in addition to an estimated 6,000 bases in the U.S., is maintaining close to 1,000 overseas bases that span the globe. The U.S. had, by late 2007, gained a military presence, according to Stanford's Chalmers Johnson, in 151 of 192 UN member nations. In 2008, AFRICOM, based in Germany, was added as a sixth command responsible for growing U.S. military presence in Africa. SOUTHCOM, based in Miami, was reorganized in 2010 to increase U.S. military presence in Latin America with bases and surveillance systems, counter-drug and counter-insurgency programs targeting manifestations of radical populism, as seen in Venezuela. The Fourth Fleet was reactivated in 2008 for the first time since World War II. The Navy now has 10 carrier strike groups patrolling international waters.
America's Navy, a global force for good.
In 2011, the U.S. sold an astonishing 78% of the world's arms. During the Bush years, Pentagon spending more than doubled to $700 billion. Although the real Pentagon budget blurs into secret functions and different departments of government, by 2010, according to the National Priorities Project, the U.S. actually spends an estimated $1.2 trillion out of its $3 trillion annual budget on military, intelligence, and homeland security. A full spectrum dominance of land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace. In November 2011, Secretary of State Clinton threw down the gauntlet on China, writing, "As the war in Iraq winds down and America begins to withdraw its forces from Afghanistan, the United States stands at a pivot point." Calling this America's Pacific Century, she meant a substantially increased military involvement in the Asia-Pacific region to contain China. Beginning with the Opium Wars in the 19th century, China has been humiliated time and again by stronger foes, Britain, Japan, Russia. It fought the U.S. to a standoff in Korea in the early 1950s. China is a proud nation, the world's second largest economy, a hybrid. Part state-owned, part capitalist, it has replaced the U.S. as Asia's main trading partner. But in 1996, Chinese leaders were humiliated again by U.S. nuclear missile rattling during another confrontation over Taiwan. And with its economic interests and shipping lanes to protect, it set out to modernize its military. In 2012, the Pentagon estimated Chinese expenditures of $160 billion. But given the secrecy of the Chinese system, the real budget is unknowable at this time. Although it has only one foreign base, its hard line over disputed oil, gas, and mineral-rich islands and territories in the East and South China Seas have escalated tensions with its regional neighbors. Internally, the government, communist in name only, remains politically backward, determined at any cost to modernize, and brutally willing to stifle dissent where its one-party rule has been questioned. Western democracies, while doing business with China, have condemned these policies to little avail. But more ominously, China has again attracted the wrath of China-bashing American hardliners whose animosity dates back to the McCarthy era. A new face-off is in the works. The U.S. has returned to Asia, seeking new alliances, rebalancing its fleet, deploying its top stealth warplanes to bases within striking distance of China by 2017. It has strengthened military alliances with China's neighbors, particularly Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines, sending 2,500 Marines to Australia, the first long-term troop increase in Asia since Vietnam. The Chinese were deeply angry over the Obama administration's new arms sales of some $12 billion to Taiwan in 2010 and 11. They have accused the U.S. of seeking to encircle them. The fear of the U.S. by others cannot be underestimated. As the late conservative political scientist Samuel Huntington acknowledged in 1996,
The West won the war not by the superiority of its ideas or values or religion, but rather by its superiority in the application of organized violence. Westerners often forget this fact. Non-Westerners never do.
Progressive China experts fear the U.S. is once again employing Truman's 1946 playbook with the Soviet Union in an attempt to contain China. The same situation exists once again with Western revulsion for China's internal policies. But this time, holding $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds, the Chinese could imperil the U.S. economy in ways the Soviets never could. Historian Alfred McCoy delineated the real stakes when he wrote, as early as 2020, the Pentagon hopes to patrol the entire globe ceaselessly, relentlessly, via a triple canopy space shield, reaching from stratosphere to exosphere, driven by drones armed with agile missiles. The triple canopy should be able to blind an entire army by knocking out ground communications, avionics, and naval navigation. But as McCoy cautions, the illusion of technological invincibility and information omniscience has failed arrogant nations in the past, as the fate of Germany in World War II and the U.S. in Vietnam attest. With tragic irony, McCoy reminds us that the U.S.'s veto of global lethality might be an equalizer for any further loss of economic strength, and that the U.S.'s fate might well be determined by which comes first in this century-long cycle: military debacle from the illusion of technological mastery, or a new technological regime powerful enough to perpetuate U.S. global dominion. But as a popular series of Star Wars movies shows, a nation dominating the world with its technology will soon become a tyranny.
Rise, my friend.
That will be hated by those who are tyrannized. China may become the first new empire to emerge in this nuclear-armed world, but an empire modeled on the U.S. or British versions would be a disaster. Great Han chauvinism would be no better than American exceptionalism. Former defense official Joseph Nye observed that the dominant power's failure to integrate the rising powers of Germany and Japan into the 20th century global system resulted in 2 catastrophic world wars. History must not be allowed to repeat itself again.